40 minutes changed everything. 40 minutes was all it took for the confidence in the most powerful economy on the planet to begin cracking wide open. And what makes this moment so extraordinary is not just the number that came out that morning. It is the way the number came out and what that moment of accidental transparency revealed about the true state of American institutions and American economic power. Right now, before the Bureau of Economic Analysis published a single official word at 8:30 in the morning, Donald Trump was already on Truth Social at 7:50 a.m., blaming Democrats for destroying the economy and citing a specific GDP figure that had not yet been released to the public. He was not speaking in metaphors. He was not estimating. He was citing a precise number tied to a precise report that was scheduled for official release exactly 40 minutes later. The markets noticed immediately, and what they heard was not a political attack on Democrats. What they heard was the President of the United States accidentally confirming that the worst-case economic scenario had arrived. The number is 1.4%. That is the annualized GDP growth rate for the fourth quarter of 2025, down from 4.4% the quarter before, well below the analyst consensus of 3%. On a $28 trillion economy, missing by 160 basis points does not represent a rounding error or a seasonal blip. It represents approximately $400 billion of annualized growth that simply did not happen. That is the size of entire national economies vanishing from the American output calculation in a single quarter. Now, before you think this is just another bad quarter that gets revised away, let me explain to you why the composition of this report is what should genuinely concern you, and why analysts who have spent careers watching economic cycles are using a word this morning that had not been spoken seriously in American economic discourse since the 1970s. That word is stagflation. And if you want to understand what the next 12 months look like for your investments, your savings, your mortgage, and your job security, you need to understand exactly what that word means and why it is so uniquely dangerous. In a normal economic slowdown, when growth falls, the Federal Reserve has a very powerful tool available. It lowers interest rates, credit becomes cheaper, businesses borrow and invest, consumers spend, and the economy accelerates back toward healthy growth. That is the standard playbook, and it has worked in every major American slowdown since World War II. But stagflation breaks that playbook completely, because stagflation is what happens when growth collapses and inflation accelerates at the same time. And when both happen simultaneously, the Fed cannot lower rates, because doing so would pour fuel onto an inflation fire that is already burning well above target. And it cannot keep rates high without strangling an economy that is already gasping for oxygen. The central bank becomes paralyzed, caught between two catastrophic outcomes with no clean exit. That's precisely where the Federal Reserve finds itself today. PCE inflation, the measure the Fed officially targets, came in at 2.9% in Q4 2025, its highest level since March 2024, moving further away from the 2% target, not closer to it, while GDP growth simultaneously collapsed by more than 2/3 in a single quarter. That combination right there is the textbook definition of a stagflationary trap, and the Fed has no comfortable move available. Here is a question for you. Right now, watching this, do you think the Federal Reserve should cut interest rates despite inflation still being this far above target? Write your answer in the comments below, because this is the debate that is going to define American economic policy for the next year, and I want to hear where you stand. Let me now walk you through the specific mechanics of what drove that 1.4% print, because the breakdown tells a story that is far more concerning than the headline number alone. Government spending collapsed by 16.6% in Q4. That single component subtracted 1.15 percentage points directly from GDP growth. The cause was the federal government shut down the longest in American history, which paralyzed federal agencies, contractors, and the entire ecosystem of businesses and workers that depend on federal activity. That shutdown did not just stop government checks from going out. It froze procurement decisions, cancelled contracts, delayed permits, and created an atmosphere of institutional uncertainty that rippled through every sector that touches federal spending. The estimated economic cost of that shutdown in annualized terms sits around $100 billion in direct lost activity, with additional indirect costs that flow through supply chains for months afterward. Consumer spending, which drives 68% of everything that happens in the American economy, slowed to 2.4% growth in Q4, down from 3.5% the quarter before. That deceleration is not random noise. It reflects something structural that has been building for several quarters. American households, particularly those in the bottom half of the income distribution, have been drawing down savings and increasing credit card balances to maintain their spending levels. The personal savings rate has dropped to its lowest level since late 2022. What that means, in plain language, is that American consumers have been spending money. They do not have to sustain an economy that looks healthier than it actually is. And that dynamic has a very clear expiration date. Exports fell 0.9% after surging 9.6% the previous quarter. American agricultural producers, industrial manufacturers, and technology exporters lost substantial revenue in international markets in a single quarter, while import compression was far more modest. The trade deficit widened. Foreign competitors captured American market share in that window, and historical data on trade patterns tells us that once market share is captured by a competitor, it rarely returns easily. The one bright spot in the report was investment in AI-related equipment, which added about 0.65 percentage points to growth. But that investment is overwhelmingly concentrated in a handful of mega-cap technology companies. The small and medium-sized businesses that supply those giants are experiencing something very different. They face input costs rising with 2.9% inflation, while their largest customers impose price freezes on contracts. The result is margin compression that shows up on quarterly earnings statements, not in GDP headlines, but will eventually show up in layoffs and reduced hiring. Now let me show you something that the mainstream American financial media has been remarkably reluctant to discuss directly because it carries politically uncomfortable implications. While American markets struggled through 2025, European equity markets delivered dramatically better performance. The fiscal stimulus deployed in Germany and across the European Union supported consumer demand and business investment in ways that American fiscal dysfunction actively prevented. Multinational corporations looking at capital allocation decisions between American operations and European operations are now working with a very different set of assumptions than they were 18 months ago. When you can deploy capital in a market with predictable fiscal policy, stable institutional governance, and improving demand, or deploy it in a market experiencing shutdown-driven output, destruction, and stagflation. Risk? The capital allocation math starts to shift. And we are seeing that shift in foreign direct investment data right now. Where are you watching from today? Drop your city and country in the comments. I always love seeing how global this community has become. This brings me to the part of the story that goes beyond the GDP number itself and gets to something more fundamental about American institutional credibility and why that matters for the cost of borrowing, for the value of the dollar, and for the long-term competitive position of the American economy in a world where capital flows freely to wherever governance is most predictable. When Trump posted on Truth Social at 7:50 a.m., citing GDP-related figures before official publication, what the global capital markets heard was not just a political message about Democrats and shutdowns. What they heard was a signal about the reliability and integrity of American economic data infrastructure. In the world of sovereign risk assessment, the discipline that determines at what interest rate a nation can borrow on international markets, institutional predictability is one of the most heavily weighted variables. Nations where economic data flows through clean, transparent official channels with controlled timing benefit from lower risk premiums. Nations where data appears to leak through informal presidential social media posts before official release introduce a variable that looks uncomfortably similar to the kind of institutional opacity that investors normally associate with emerging market economies. That is not a rhetorical point. It is a mechanical one. Every basis point of additional risk premium that gets priced into American sovereign debt translates directly into higher borrowing costs for the federal government, higher mortgage rates for American homeowners, and higher financing costs for American businesses. The institutional erosion does not announce itself with a single dramatic market crash. It accumulates quietly, quarter by quarter, report by report, leak by leak, until the cumulative premium becomes impossible to ignore. And here is what makes the timing so particularly difficult. The current chair of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, is expected to be replaced in the coming months. The incoming leadership is broadly expected by market analysts to maintain a hawkish stance on interest rates, to prevent inflation expectations from becoming embedded in long-term wage and price-setting behavior. That means the monetary policy environment that has already been choking the rate-sensitive sectors of the American economy, which means housing and auto manufacturing and durable goods production, is not going to soften anytime soon. The builders who structured their 2026 project pipelines around an assumption of falling mortgage rates are going to be revising those plans. The auto manufacturers who projected volume increases based on cheaper financing are going to be revising those forecasts. And the federal budget math, which already assumes significant refinancing of the national debt at whatever rate the market demands, gets more expensive. With every basis point the risk premium expands. The housing market deserves particular attention here because it sits at the intersection of monetary policy rate sensitivity and consumer financial health in a way that makes it one of the most important leading indicators of broader economic conditions. Existing home sales volumes are near decade lows. Builders are offering increasingly large concessions to move inventory. New household formation is being delayed as younger Americans cannot make the monthly payment math work at current mortgage rates. And with rates now projected to remain elevated well into 2026, there is no visible catalyst for relief in the near term. That sustained freeze in housing activity has cascading effects across construction, employment, furniture and appliance, retail, interior services, legal and financial transaction volume, and consumer sentiment more broadly. Here is your second question for today. We are seeing consumer spending, slow mortgage activity, freeze, and corporate margins compress at the same time. Do you think the United States is already in a recession or heading into one in 2026? Leave your answer in the comments. The responses to this question last time were some of the most insightful economic discussions this community has produced. Let me now give you my forward projection, because understanding where we are is only useful if it helps you think about where we are going. The current analyst consensus for full year 2026 GDP growth sits somewhere between 2.5 and 2.8%. I think that consensus is going to be revised downward as the Q4 data and its implications work through the forecasting models of the major banks and research institutions. My projection is that we are more likely to see full year 2026 growth land in the range of 1.8 to 2.1%, with meaningful downside risk. If the stagflationary dynamic becomes self-reinforcing through weakening consumer confidence and further corporate margin compression. The sectors most exposed to that revision are the ones most dependent on discretionary consumer spending. Retail operators, restaurants and entertainment companies built their 2026 guidance on GDP assumptions that are already proving too optimistic. Expect earnings revisions in those sectors of 15 to 20% as reality catches up to guidance. The commercial real estate sector, which is already dealing with its own structural challenges from remote work patterns, now faces an additional headwind from weaker economic activity and persistently high financing costs. Expect that pressure to surface in regional bank balance sheets over the coming 2 quarters. Meanwhile, the companies and economies best positioned to capture the relative value shift are those operating in markets with more stable fiscal and institutional foundations. European and certain Asian manufacturers will continue absorbing market share from American exporters who face input cost inflation and international demand weakness simultaneously. And once competitive market share is established, historical patterns tell us it takes significant time and investment to reclaim. The deeper message in all of this, and the one that I think matters most for your understanding of where we stand right now, is that this is not simply the story of one weak quarter. The 4.4% growth in Q3 to 1.4% growth in Q4 represents a 68% collapse in growth rate in a single 3-month period, while PCE inflation simultaneously moved 45% further above the Federal Reserve's target. That combination in that magnitude, in that time frame, is not a weather event or a seasonal adjustment or a data quirk. It is a structural signal, and structural signals require structural responses, not just talking points on social media. The institutional dimension of what happened the morning that GDP data was published matters beyond the political theater of it. When the President of the United States signals non-public economic data through an informal social media post 40 minutes before official release, it creates information asymmetry. It means someone who is paying close attention to truth social had 40 minutes of advance information that other participants in the market did not have. That is the kind of institutional governance failure that does not happen in economies that successfully maintain the premium global capital allocators have historically attached to American institutional credibility. The road back from a stagflationary configuration, if history is any guide, is not quick and it is not painless. The 1970s episode that economists always reference when this topic arises lasted nearly a decade, involved multiple recessions, required genuinely painful monetary policy decisions, and created lasting damage to the competitive positioning of American industry. The conditions today are not identical to 1970, but the mechanism is the same, and the warning signals in the data are now clear enough that ignoring them because they are politically inconvenient would be a genuine analytical failure. If you stayed with me through this entire breakdown, it is because you understand that the numbers matter and the context around the numbers matters even more. Subscribe and turn on notifications because the next set of economic releases is coming, and based on everything we covered today, the configuration that produced this result has not changed. The underlying dynamics that drove a 1.4% print are still in motion, and the policy tools that would normally be used to address them are not available in the way they usually would be. That is the reality behind the headline number, and that is the conversation the mainstream coverage is not fully having yet